All right, so today I want to make something a little weird, a cheese chocolate. We'll see how it turns out. A few weeks ago, I put out a community post to ask to see if I should use some cheese powder to make a cheese chocolate bar. 100% of the responses were in favor of it. And in fact, 39% of you wanted the cheese chocolate bar so much, you voted that you were green with envy that I would be able to taste such an amazing product. All right, so since I have a mandate from you guys, let's go ahead and get started. So to make a cheese chocolate bar, we're gonna need some cheese. And about 2 weeks ago, I made a video where I made some cheese powder out of some mild cheddar using a freeze dryer. After that video, I ended up with a bunch of cheese powder left over. So that's what we're gonna use. So my kind of thinking here was to make a white chocolate bar with just, a little cheese in it. So let's go ahead and gather all the ingredients we're gonna need to use. First off, we're gonna need some sweetness. And for that, I'm gonna be using sweetness in the form of powdered sugar. So for this, I decided to use about 75 grams of powdered sugar. Next, I decided to measure out about 50 grams of powdered milk. And I figured this would help mellow out the flavor of the cheese and give a little bit of something that's kind of reminiscent of a white chocolate bar. Now lastly, I added 75 grams of the mild cheddar cheese powder. Now the ratio here was sort of a guess, and if you're crazy enough to try to make this yourself, feel free to play with this ratio. But honestly, this turned out to be a pretty good starting point, I think. All right, so additionally, we're gonna need 120 grams of cocoa butter, and cocoa butter is solid at room temperature, so it's what's gonna give the chocolate the structure and actually be able to make it something we can eat in our mouths at room temperature. And this is really why I don't like using coconut oil, which isn't really super solid at room temperature. I mean, I guess it depends on where you are in the world and how hot your room is. And now, although cocoa butter is solid at room temperature, we're gonna need to melt some cocoa butter when milling it. So while I wait for that to melt in my oven, because for some crazy reason I still don't have a microwave, I'm going to start setting up my wet mill. Now, if you don't have a wet mill, I think this recipe would work pretty well if you were using something like a blender, just like I did in my white chocolate video. Okay, so now that I'm done setting up the wet mill, the first thing I did was to toss in some of that melted cocoa butter and turn the wet grinder on. Now this will allow all the pieces of the wet mill to get coated and lubricated. Once that ran for a few seconds, I added in the mix of cheese and milk powder and powdered sugar and tried to add it somewhat slowly so it didn't really clump up. So once everything's in here, we're just gonna let the wet grinder go. Now for those who haven't seen one of these things before, it's really just gonna grind up all the pieces until it's a really small grain size, making it virtually imperceptible to detect any particles. And that's just gonna leave us with a smooth chocolate bar. Essentially, it's just a motorized mortar and pestle, and it's just really just gonna crush everything to super tiny. So I just let it go and go and go, and I would just occasionally feel it for texture. I mean, the goal of this is we really want to make sure that it gets as smooth as possible. Now I let mine mill for about 4 hours because I got sucked into the new Age of Empires game and got distracted from filming. But honestly, if you have a wet mill like this and it's rated for chocolate, you can, and most chocolatiers do, go for even longer. But at this point, I was pretty well satisfied how crushed up everything was, and the last step is to temper the chocolate. Now, one of these days, I pinky promise that I'm going to do a video on how to temper chocolate from scratch, but it's a real pain in the butt to do it from scratch. So that's why I always end up just adding a tiny piece of tempered chocolate in to get the process going. Now, in this case, I decided to toss in a few white chocolate chips, which in retrospect, I'm not 100% sure that these were tempered either. Oh well. Okay, so once the chocolate chips were crushed to death in the wet mill, I turned it off and poured the cheesy, chocolatey, gooey mixture into molds and just let them cool. And once they completely cooled, I pulled them out and they look like this. All right, so how did it turn out? Well, first let's do the snap test. It does snap, and we're able to get some bars. Now, how does it taste? It's not terrible. It does taste pretty good though in the end. After the initial funky cheese kind of mellows out, it really kind of tastes like cheesecake. So if you want to, you can turn cheese into a chocolate bar. And I think, why not? I mean, who's gonna stop you? It's not illegal, as far as I know. It might be illegal. You gotta check your own jurisdictions. All right, that's it for today. And I'll see you guys next week. And if you have any other suggestions for some weird stuff to combine, I love doing these kinds of videos. So just let me know and we'll try to actually make more of these videos in the future. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season if you're watching this video when it comes out, and see you guys later.